Hello, everybody. My name is Tom Stebbins, and I'm the county agent for Hamilton County, Tennessee. And this is a video I put together for Master Gardener training, and it's basically entitled Insect Diagnosis. So we'll go through some of the highlights of identifying insects. Insects are very interesting. They've been around for so many years, and there's so many. They say there's 1 million insects that have been identified, and I've heard people say that there's even another 1 million insects yet to be identified. So that's amazing to me. They thrive in so many different environments, and they eat our food, which that's sometimes why we don't like certain insects. There's a definite fossil record for insects. If you go even around Tennessee in some of the riverbeds, you'll see some of the embedded insects that were a long time ago. Here's some of the numbers, huge numbers for beetles and flies. It seems like they would take over the world, and in fact, they would if our species no longer existed. They would definitely be still around. And so insects can be on the surface, they can be in the air, they can be in the water, they can be underneath the ground. There's generally 2 different types of life cycles, and it's important to know these because in controlling different stages, different insects, it's nice to know which stage we're aiming at. Oftentimes we're aiming at the egg stage because it's not yet developed yet, and it's not yet doing damage. And there's a growth stage called gradual metamorphosis. Basically, there's just 3 stages: egg, nymph, and adult. The nymph is a word that just means undeveloped adult. And so the nymph usually doesn't have its waxy coating on its body yet, but the true bugs are in this category. We'll talk about some true bugs. Cicadas, those screeching insects you hear in the summertime, and some of them that show up every 11 years and 13 years. Aphids are little tiny soft-bodied insects. And scale don't even look like an insect. They just kind of lay over like a little crustacean that sits on the plant. Then the next part, here's the nymph, and then the adult is a little bit bigger, goes through some stages where the nymph grows, and then it sheds its skin, and then it grows again. The other type of metamorphosis, which means changing, is a complete metamorphosis. And most others we know pretty well. It starts out with the egg, and then it goes into a larvae stage, which looks like a worm or a caterpillar. And what's missing, that's the overwintering pupa, very hard coating. Usually it's resistant to any kind of controls. The insects are very smart. They found a way to hide themselves and protect themselves. And then the adult emerges, and often that's a good time to try to do some kind of control, but especially if insects are flying around, that's not always so easy. So maybe the best places to control insects are either at the egg stage or in the larvae stage. And as I said, they don't always look the same at different times of the year. Now, a plant can have a lot of different insects at different times of the year. Normally, a plant doesn't have everything all at once, but here's just a diagram to show the different places where insects can be basically everywhere on the plant. They can have galls, they can be chewing, they can be underground, they can be sucking, egg laying, or they could be spreading diseases. So here's some of the signs. So actually we're looking at either the live insect or their aftermath, but it's something that's can actually be insect tissue. We can see eggs down here of a mite. There's an empty egg. There's usually, when they're golden, that means there's an undeveloped life stage inside of there. You can see here's little skins of an aphid, or that could have been a whitefly. You can see they're in a nest right here, like a tent caterpillar. Not sure what that one is. That could be, I know this is a cicada over here. That's another case, it looks like. I should know what that one is. Everyone usually asks me. So now let's look at some of the symptoms or the types of injury that insect can cause. You wouldn't know which insect is on either one of these examples right here unless you went looking. Sometimes you'll look in the soil. Sometimes you'll just turn the leaf over and just kind of see what might be there. Let's look at the one on the left. We look around and we see this hard-shelled bodied insect, and those could be beetles. And like it said in the one slide, 300,000 beetles maybe. I think Tennessee would probably have a couple thousand. This one would be a caterpillar, maybe eating it. Take a look on the one on the left. I'm always thinking that that could be a disease because the hole isn't all the way through. But you look around and maybe you'll find something that looks like that. That's one of those true bugs. True bugs often have angular. See how that angles? Some people say it's a diamond shape. This one is called the four-lined plant bug. I don't know where all the four lines are. Maybe there's 1, 2, 3, 4, something like that. And then the one over here is, it could be fertilizer, whatever, but looking at the underside. Always check the underside of leaves that are not looking good. And in this case, we look underneath there, and here's what we call scale. Doesn't look like an insect, does it? But it's got kind of a oyster shell looking thing. So it's just laying on the plant. Often it's on the underside, and often these are the females, and it has a tube that just lays in there, and a tube running inside of the plant and sucking out juices. The one on the left, it's hard to tell what that is. You might look at it real close and you might see a few holes here and there. And this could be just what they call frass, basically just ground up sawdust that it came out of the hole. Maybe it's partly insects materials. And in this case, inside that tree are borers just boring away, and maybe they throw some of that sawdust out on the ground, and that's what that is. And over here, it looks like something's crawling through the leaf. And if you took botany and realized that leaf often has two layers, the top layer and the bottom layer, and this little creature can get right in between those two layers of leaves. And it's often a fly that does that. And the fly lays its egg. It might even insert the egg at some places. And then once inside, it's a leaf miner, and it just goes and eats its way through, and it's very protected, and so it can be right inside that little leaf and cause damage. Now here's one that looks like a bump, a red bump on a leaf, and there's lots of these in nature, If you took those bumps and looked at them under the microscope, or even if you just took them and looked at them real close with a hand lens, you might see some little tiny mites. These would be hard to see with a hand lens, but you could see that those are little things, and they're very, very small little mites. Now, mites are not considered insects because their adult stage has 8 legs instead of 6 like an insect. But in talking here, we usually include the mites with the insects. On the other side, it's a big, fat, furry gall of some kind. And if we took that apart, we might even see some stages of a wasp. These are called gall wasps. So often we need to either look for pictures based on the name of the plant to see if, we look under a certain shrub and say it looks like a gall, and we try to figure out what the gall is. We could actually break open the galls and see if it's a wasp and go from there. So on the left here, we see some root injury, and we look underneath there, and there's sort of a half C-shaped larvae type looking thing. And that's usually usually we call that a grub, white grub in this case. And there's different types of grubs we'll talk about later. The most popular one, or the most one that we know, is Japanese beetle. I don't think this is a Japanese beetle one. And the one on the right is damage to seeds, and there could be worms in the soil. In this case, it's called a wire worm that's damaging that seed even before, even as it's germinating. So you can see insects get on all kinds of things. Here we see some damage happening to a limb or a little branch. And if we look real close, we could see these are eggs that are slitted right into that bark. So there's an egg, 2, 3, 4, 5, maybe 12 eggs in that one slit. And if we read up on it, we'd say, well, that's a cicada. In this case, it's one of those 11-year, comes out every 11 years or 13 years, and they have the red eyes. There's some that are called dog day cicadas, which come out every year, and their eyes are, what are they? More black, more dark. These are called cicadas. Over here, it looks like too, it's a very nice pattern of holes. Again, maybe that's probably where the female's putting eggs in those little holes. In this case, it's very diagnostic for a tree cricket. Now, insects can also vector diseases. They carry the spores, they can insert, they can take their mouth parts, and they can draw up viral particles and inject them in different plants. They can do the same thing with bacteria and fungi. They can carry them on their legs. They can carry them on their body parts, all kinds of things, different ways that they can vector diseases. Here's a very important one, that vector disease. It's called the elm bark beetle. And it was a nasty disease that got into the American elms and pretty much wiped out most of the elms in our country, probably around the world. You can see where it scratched into the tree, probably on the lower part of the tree. And then the fungus got in there, the Dutch elm disease fungus got in there, and it closed off the vascular system. And you can see here's a branch that's showing flagging or yellowing. And that means that branch got full of bacteria. Now, if you waited several years, probably more branches would get that, and eventually that tree would die. There's a lot of examples. Here's a little leafhopper. These leafhoppers are the insects you see that walk sideways. When you either touch them or watch them for a long time, they'll move sideways, and then maybe they'll go a little bit. Then they'll move sideways again. So that's kind of what a leafhopper is. And they scratch leaves too, and they can insert a bacterial disease. And if they insert that bacterial disease in a number of different trees, here's an oak leaf, looks like a red oak. It can actually inject that or get the bacteria inside, and then eventually it gets inside the vascular system and shuts off the water. Looks like drought because the water's not getting to the edges, but it's basically a bacterial disease. And really the only way to identify that is through experience or comparative. If there is no drought going on and you see that, then you could take some of those leaves. In my case, we would take about 10 leaves and we'd put them in a Ziploc bag. We'd send them off to a lab in Indiana, and the lab would crush those leaves and get the sap out of them, and they could do a serology test to tell if that is the disease. Once you know that it is, then you might want to take that tree out because there's no cure. There's been some tries of putting some bactericides. If you catch it early, you might be able to get some satisfaction from that, but my understanding is it's not too successful. So that's bacterial leaf scorch. And that's what a tree can look like. Normally it's oak trees, it's sycamore trees. I think a number of other trees are susceptible to that same leafhopper. And then our grand old honeybees can cause their own problem. It can cause a disease called fire blight. And fire blight is a bacterial disease. It can occur on a number of plants. Apple, pear are two that can get pretty bad. That's called fire blight. So we're not going to kill the honeybees, but we're going to try to prune out any fire blight. Usually in a usual year, you'll get maybe 1, 2, 5, 10 branches that get that, and then you can cut them out and carry on with your plant or your crop. Other years you might get quite a few, but there's no way to steer the honeybees away from trees that works real well. Some pests have chewing mouth parts. Here's a good example of a bagworm. Bagworms look like little Christmas ornaments up in the tree, and they're made of really tough silk and bits of twigs. You try to pull those apart and they're just impossible. It's almost like Kevlar. And so inside of those is where the female develops, usually in the wintertime, develops about 20 eggs and then little babies. And so in the spring at a certain time, you can see down here, they're just covered. This would be a great time to get out there and pluck those off. Take little scissors and cut them off. Get as many of those as you can, because when the time is right, the weather conditions are just right, and it's hard to spray at this time of year too, because the spray just doesn't penetrate that bag. But there's a certain time of the year, usually it's going to be sometime in April, May, that they'll emerge. I think I've got a picture of this. Here's the female inside of there. The male is impregnating the female at that point, and the female gets inside the bag, produces all these eggs. Looks like there's more than 20. It looks like there could be 50 in there. They emerge in mid-May and feed up until August. And what they do is these eggs will hatch into a small little larvae that just eats its way through the branches, and eventually, and it carries the bag, basically it drags the bag around all summer long and keeps feeding and feeding, and the bag gets bigger and bigger, and finally it attaches itself to a branch, and then the life cycle continues. So the best time to control it is try to get it when they just come out of the bag, like right here, and spray and try to get those little larvae killed before they go to another spot. We'll see these right about now. We'll see that two different types, one or probably more than two, but the two main types is eastern tent caterpillars on cherry apple, crab apple, and many, many others. They look like tents in the tree. And so it's really hard to control those. A lot of times I tell people, don't even try, because they're way up high in the tree, and often it's not going to do that much good, because the chemical is going to be hard to get through the tent, and it's going to be, spraying very high. Most people don't have the equipment. And also the pest just takes its course, and after about 3 weeks, about a month, most of these caterpillars will run their course, and when they produce all the larvae and the worms, they fall to the ground, and they're pretty good, either fertilizer or useful for birds and other creatures that can use them. So these cycles have been going on and on and on for a long, long time. And so they're basically moths that are doing this. Let's see. You can see the eastern tent caterpillar. The forest tent caterpillar is more just woven on the leaves. They're pretty fascinating to learn about them or to study them. They do some marching. They march up and down the branch. Sometimes they'll leave the tent and go looking for food. And it's really hard to control that. If it's on a real small tree, it could be wise to get some insecticide, just some general all-purpose insecticide, and stick the sprayer inside of there and try to kill as much as possible. But for large trees, I usually tell people just let it run its course, because it may look bad at a certain time, but the tree usually adapts. Got some. There's other worms that aren't the same as tent caterpillars. This one is called a canker worm. Another name that I use is just an inchworm. You can see when it crawls along the ground, it pulls itself and causes the back to rise up, and it just inches away. So again, they might be on certain trees, elm, apple, beech. It can be in the spring or the fall, and the trees can look pretty bad too. Here's the adult female, and they can look pretty bad. I think I got a picture. Here's a defoliation of hackberry in the early spring, and then and it's going to be doing it right now if it's got the weather conditions perfect. Then maybe by June, you won't even notice it. The leaves will pop back out and the leaves will act like there was no problem. There's some egg cases usually on the leaves. That's where they overwinter for a large extent. So they're right up there waiting to hatch when the time is right. In this case, the walnut caterpillar is active through September. Feeds on black walnut, butternut, hickory, and pecan. I would guess to say that almost every tree has its share of some kind of a caterpillars, which makes a good life cycle. It's not that we want to get rid of every last little caterpillar because they're very useful for the biology of the forest. We just don't like to have them eating up our ornamental trees in our yard. Here's one that can be quite common through June through August. On oak, hickory, birch, hazelnut. And in this case, you can identify them, but I've had fun trying to identify different caterpillars. This one happens to have a nice orange stripe, so you might be able to pull that off with some. And on the internet these days, you can look things up and you could just say caterpillar with a yellow stripe or a caterpillar with an orange stripe and see what you get. I bet you get pretty close, especially if you say it's on an oak tree. Then you can learn a little bit about its life cycle and what to do about it or what to not do about it. Like I said, I usually tell people just to enjoy, watch. It's going to defoliate your tree possibly, but the tree will come back pretty quick, a couple weeks after the life cycle is over. Now there's a couple, and this is one of them that doesn't just go away after a couple weeks. This one's called gypsy moth. And not sure exactly where it came from. We always blame the Far East or China or someplace like that, and that may be true, but it's been here a while, and we've been fighting this foreign pest for quite a long time. When I was working for the Department of Agriculture, we would go out on missions to look at traps. Often you can put little sticky traps in the tree, and you can see where the males are trying to find the females. So there's a little female pheromone inside the trap, and the males will go and check that out. And so you can make a count. Well, the gypsy moth doesn't go away. The larvae just eats its weight in leaves every day or more, and it can travel, especially through the forest areas. And it's really non-specific. It'll eat just about anything. And so the Department of Agriculture and the United States Department of Agriculture often will try to control it to some extent, especially on a bad year. They don't want the whole forest to go downhill because of this insect. You may see it in your own property, and that's not good either, but still there's ways to control, but often it's something that homeowners don't like to have the pesticides around. Whereas the state demands that we save the forest because that's a very big industry in our state. There's another one called sawflies, and these have they have more than 5 pairs of prolegs, which means they have all these little fat legs that stick out from the side. It's a little fly because it has just 1 pair of wings. And so it can do its number on usually you'll see it on pine, in this case the pine sawfly. Now here's the grubs. We talked about the white grubs before. We know about the June beetle. If you're growing up in anywhere in the United States, the June beetle is usually the bigger one, and that'll translate into that big June bug. Whereas some of these other ones, including the Japanese beetle, which I think is this one, and they can be identified basically by the little hairs on the bottom end, basically on the butt of their body there. I've tried, I mean, you can if you really have a microscope or a good hand lens, but basically you can just figure out that the green June bugs and the other ones, Japanese beetles, then sometimes you'll find little grubs in the turf. These little grubs, the tenuous, the black tenuous grub can be the worst one of all. That's what I've been told. Black turfgrass and tenuous can eat the, but the Japanese beetle has been known to eat roots on turf. The green June beetle, I don't know what it does. It really, I've seen those so bad on trees, and they seem like they could eat a lot, but I understand they don't eat anything when they're out. So maybe they're just a natural phenomena that goes back into the ground and does a lot of eating there. So here's the green June beetle, the Japanese beetle. Let's see, and the little turf bug. So those are the ones that we usually see. I guess we see other chafers, rose chafer. I don't think I have a real good picture of that one right here, but there's a lot of those little bugs out there. Here's what the Japanese beetle can do. Japanese beetle skeletonizes leaves. It just makes a skeleton out of them. And this usually happens pretty much May through June. It's like it's like 4 weeks of battle against this beetle. So it's up to you if you want to really go after it. A lot of people, if they can, especially on smaller trees, it's probably worth it. Once your tree gets bigger, it's going to defoliate or it's going to skeletonize the leaves, but then it'll settle down and the leaves will come back out. It's okay on most years, but if the year turns out to be a real drought year, that can affect the health of that tree. Sprays don't necessarily work too good. 7 dust or 7 spray is probably the best you can do. You can even pick them off if it's high enough. Pick off a large number of them and put them in soapy water. That's one method people use. Aphids. Aphids are soft-bodied insects. If you've ever seen them, they look really cute, actually. They're nice little, they've got little families underneath the leaves usually. They're soft. They've got this long snout or proboscis mouth part that can jab into the plant and suck out juices. They have live birth. They can sometimes have a winged life cycle or part of their life cycle, so they can fly away to other places. I've seen them in pepper fields up in Michigan and Tennessee, and because they move around a little bit like that, they can transmit viruses. They can really do a number on a field. So the insect itself is sucking juices, but the big problem is introducing a virus which can completely kill the plant if it gets in it too bad. One thing about aphids, some of them anyway, can produce sooty mold, and sooty mold is basically, well, first it starts out with honeydew, and honeydew is that liquid that the aphids give off when they're sucking juices out of the plant, and they go out the other end and turn into just clear, sugary material. And then the fungus from the air, the sooty mold, gets inside of that dripping stuff and produces just droplets of this black sooty mold. And so it's not pathogenic, but it can really drip on cars and lawn furniture and other plants. Hostas can look terrible. It's not going to kill your hostas, but it's going to make them look really black and just unsightly. So I'll say a little bit about how to control this. There's some chemicals, especially chemicals that will get inside the tree, systemics, and they'll kill the aphid up in the tree so that it won't produce the honeydew. and thus won't produce the dripping. Normally what you have to do is get that chemical in the spring of the year, because it takes about a month or two or more to get that material in the tree, and finally it'll stop the honeydew, or kill the aphids, but it'll stop the honeydew as well. And the chemical is a common chemical that, again, systemic. You'd have to go to the garden center to check it out and see if that's something you like to use, or maybe just let the aphid run its course. And here's the one called Asian woolly hackberry aphid. And it says it all there. It probably came from Asia. It's woolly. It has all this wax. You can see there's an aphid still underneath there. And we discovered this when I was working in the lab. There was a sample that came in, so we went out. We didn't know what it was, so we went out to the farm that had reported it, and lo and behold, we said, "Wow, this looks like it's going to be a bad problem." And so, yes, it became a problem. That was about 20 years ago, and we thought lady beetles might help it, but I don't think they're doing much good. So the way to control it is through those chemicals. And fortunately, it's pretty well stuck to certain trees, the hackberry aphid and I think the sugarberry plant. In the middle of summer, you may see these things floating in the air. You've seen these floating waxy things, and that's what these are, these hackberry aphids. Pretty common. If you grow azaleas, you'll probably see lace bugs. They're pretty common. They look like someone had a sewing needle and they just sewed the whole leaf with these little dots. So what this insect does is it just penetrates and sucks the little juice here, keeps going and going and going. And so it's apparent on the leaf surface. They overwinter as eggs. Very rarely you're going to see the insect. Often you'll see its droppings, that little thing right there. You'll see a lot of that. And you'll also just see all the stippling on the top, all the little marks that it makes. And again, there's some systemics, there's some sprays you can get from the garden center that helps work on this. Here's a plant bug. At the introduction, we saw this one, and this one can get on 250 host plants. I normally see it on herbs and mints and some of the other herbs. And so, yeah, I didn't know that. Enzymes attack the glue that holds the plant cells together and causing these pits. So they're kind of an interesting insect. Again, if you're looking at your plants and you see some of these, sometimes you can pick them off by hand. You want to be careful. Some of them have mouth parts that could probably stick you too. So you want to be careful. You can whisk them off into some soapy water. A lot of these plant bugs aren't very susceptible to any kind of sprays. For some reason, they're just not very. They don't respond real good to pesticides. Maybe it's because they just build up a tolerance for them. Here's another one that can, and these guys, look at that. Look at their mouth part. It goes all the way down to almost half their body. And they can stick that into just about any fruit. These are very terrible in orchards, in fruit places, because they can stick that into a growing tomato or an apple. And what happens, it makes a dead spot or a corky spot in that fruit. And then most of the commercial people can't sell those fruit. We can cut it out and eat it, but it's not saleable. Here's some examples of scale. This one is a very common. It's on euonymus plants, which are a common landscape plant. And you look underneath the leaves, and you'll see these shell-like things. And there's those bigger ones like that are the female, and underneath the female is actually underneath that coating. And the white little bodies, those are the males. But the females are doing the damage because underneath there they have a long straw-like mouth part that sticks into the leaf. They don't move very much. They'll hatch, I guess that might be the right term, but there can be 3 generations. And what happens is they'll produce little crawlers. If you can look close enough at this picture, you'll see all these little crawlers, usually they're colorful, orange, light colored. And those little crawlers just move around and move to other parts of the plant. So you can see over a short period of time, the scale can really go crazy. Now, there's a few things that go after scale. And a lot of them are, I've got a couple pictures coming up. A lot of them like to go after that nice juicy female in there. So they'll come along, maybe it's a wasp, and they'll make a hole right in the shell, and they'll suck the juices out of there. And that's what you'd like. You don't want the scale damaging it, and these wasps are wasps that don't even hurt us. They're solitary wasps, so they're ones that don't even have damage. Let's see. So here's another scale. This is called obscure scale because it's very hard to see. And it can be on, this is an oak tree that can get on it. There's a very bad problem with this in Chattanooga along the riverfront. They've tried to spray chemicals on here for control, and they found out it does a good job one year, but then the next year they can't afford the thousands of dollars. So I've suggested that they plant flower gardens along here and try to encourage these wasps with this. See this little hole that drilled in there? So certain wasps, I don't know if we can, some of our biologists know which wasps do this, but they're pretty universal, and they like to hang out with nice mints or nice little native flowers. So my suggestion, and I talked to an entomologist about this, and we're suggesting just little pocket gardens along the path right there might be enough to get enough of those solitary wasps that could go around and keep that under control. Here's another real bright scale on tulip poplar. You can see the nymphs taking off. And this one causes sooty mold as well. Not all scales do, but the ones that cause sooty mold can be controlled with a chemical, the same chemical that we put in the ground for azalea lacebug and boxwood leaf miner. Some of those chemicals can be used in that regard too, those systemic chemicals. Mites are really interesting. There's a cool season mite and there's warm season mites. The cool season mites are out right now when it's cool. They hatch out of their little eggs. Here's the little eggs. And they start crawling, and there's 8 legs on the mites. They're not considered an insect, but we cover them here because they act like insects a lot. So the cool season ones, they scratch a lot, basically on the branches. Sometimes if these get going in the fall, when it's cool in the fall, then the plant can be very susceptible to a cold freezing. So you want to keep these under control. One way to, well, here's the spruce spider mite. And overwinters in the spring and late summer and fall. Overwinters in the egg stage. So a lot of people, the way to control these is to cover the needles with a oil spray. Either soapy spray or oil. I think the oil works better because it lasts longer. But you think about this, if you put a little coating of oil on there, it will drown out, basically you're trying to drown out the eggs before they hatch. It'll also drown out the adults or the moving ones too. Here's a good analysis of spruce spider mites. You see there's ones either hatching or they're empty, and quite a few more to go. I like to look under a dissecting scope because then I can see either how many eggs are still ready to come out. Sometimes I can see the crawling stages. And sometimes, like in the winter, I'll look, and if I see a lot of empty eggs, I know that there was a problem there in the fall. So I can tell the client, I can say, well, you had a problem last fall. That's probably what's causing winter injury on your plants. So here's a southern red. It's a cool season mite. Gets on whorls. They can build up populations very quickly. Here's one that's a warm season mite that occurs on lots and lots of plants, even in the greenhouse. We see two-spotted spider mites a lot. You've probably seen these. If you look close, you'll see two black blotches on the mite itself. It loves to go after trees that are suffering from the drought. One way to look at them is to take a leaf like this and slap it on a white piece of paper, and you can see the crawling stages of the mite take off on the paper, and you can get some feel for just how many mites are on there if you don't have a microscope or a big hand lens. We talked a little bit about leaf miners, and here's what they do. Leaf miners, there's different ones, and it's hard to put a chemical or something to control it at that stage. You pretty much have to wait till it emerges, probably in the spring again, or pick off. Sometimes you can just pick off that leaf and throw those leaves away that it's gotten established. You don't want to do the whole thing like on columbine. You can't take the whole plant away, but a lot of times they attack one or two leaves, and that's a good way to control it, just by clipping off those leaves and trashing them. Don't throw them right on the ground, but trash them. Here's a very, very common one on boxwood. If you see boxwoods with just a little splotches hanging around, you take a little tiny pocket knife, kitchen knife or something sharp, cut those open, turn them over and cut them in. Chances are you'll see this little larvae sitting in there, and that's what causes that. And they can disfigure the plant pretty quickly. It's an easy one to control with that systemic insecticide. And that's what it looks like. There's a female and adult, female and male, or female and male stages. It's pretty interesting. Now the borers, the peachtree borer, these are insects. They're either moths or other types of insects. I don't know how many different types of adults, but this one is a moth. It's a moth that goes around. It probably can smell a peach tree a mile away. And so it gets on a peach tree, usually on the lower part of the trunk, and either lays an egg on the outside, or it injects the egg into underneath the bark. Then the egg takes over and starts eating the bark away. Sometimes it can get under the bark, and it causes a lot of damage. This is probably just the tree responding with all that sap, trying to control it. Here's one on dogwood that's very common. Here it emerges from late April to mid-October. So they make these little entry points, and usually they don't kill the tree that quickly. Usually it takes a while for them, and you can kind of see what's going on. And then the way to control these is you go to the garden center or hardware store and buy what they call a borer spray, a borer, B-O-R-E-R, borer spray. And it's a spray that you put in a pump spray, and you try to coat as much as the lower half of the tree as you can. You don't have to go up real high, because usually it's either in the lower part or maybe face high, right in that area. If you coat the bark with that spray, it lasts a good long time. You can put a spray on the spring and one in the fall, and that kind of gives you control for a year long. You might read the label on the borer spray that you pick and see what they recommend, but that's usually what we recommend. Now here's one that can be a little bit more damaging, and we'll talk about a couple of those coming up. These can be in trees. If they get the larvae stage underneath the bark, they make what they call a gallery. It just goes back and forth. This may take a year or two for this to happen, and pretty soon that's right where the growing point is on the trees, and so the tree's not going to last very long, especially if that gets going all the way around the tree. And sometimes the borers have either a round hole, or here it's a D-shaped exit hole. And so sometimes we can tell which borer it is that has round or the D shape. There's probably 20 different bores that it can occur, but there's a couple. You can see what happens to the tree. It just becomes unthrifty. It's very susceptible to frost cracks. It's very hard to get a spray in there too. Sometimes the borers have beautiful beetles that cause it. These are very colorful, long-horned beetles, very regal looking. Some of them are probably native, but quite a few of them are foreign pests that have come in. So they're out there going after some of our most best trees that we have in the forest. Let's see, there's one, a roundhead borer gets inside. Here this one bores deep into the wood after a while. Here's one that's been a nemesis for a lot of our trees coming out of the nursery. For a while there, we would only see it in the nursery on stressed trees. Now we're starting to see it more and more in homeowners' property, and usually it's a tree about this size, maybe about 3 or 4 inch in diameter. And what it is, it's a little beetle, 1/10 of an inch long. It looks like a little bullet, and it puts its head down and just starts eating straight into the tree. It goes straight in. It might curve, and I guess I've cut open trees and it does curve and go, but right at first it goes straight into the tree, and out the back end comes a little fungus. It's a fungus with the tree sawdust connected. And these, we refer to these as toothpicks because they just look like toothpicks. And then when it rains, all this stuff falls to the bottom. But inside the tree, it's killing the tree. When I see a tree with just 2 or 3 of these on there, I say it's a goner. And there's ways to control it, but boy, you really got to get on it. More or less, if you see this on one of your trees, then you want to spray the other trees that don't have it, just to save those. Unfortunately, right now, normally we don't see it widespread in anybody's yard. If you see a tree, chances are it's not going to go through every tree in your yard. It gets on a lot of trees. It gets on probably every tree. There's some that are more prone than others to get this problem. We talked a little bit about galls. Galls are mostly, if they're on the leaf, they're very curious, very interesting, but often they're not something you have to worry about too much. I wouldn't spray for galls. I think, at least not for the spotted galls or the spindle galls or those ones on leaves. They're interesting, but not necessarily a demand that you have to spray and get rid of all those spots. But sometimes they're bigger. They're twig galls like that, or 3 in a row. It'd be great if you could just prune that out. Sometimes though, they get right on the main trunk, and then it's hard to repair a tree that has it on the main trunk. But normally these bigger galls can strangle a branch, so it's wise if you can possibly prune it out, if you can possibly get that done. Now, some of the big problems we're having with insects, we talked about Dutch elm disease and chestnut blight. Those seem to be back in the day of our grandfathers or great-grandfathers. But even in today, we're talking about new viruses that are going through the world right now with us. That's why I'm indoors doing this video. But insects are somewhat similar in that we get these from places, mostly from another country. And the reason why I'm saying that is because if they come in, and we trade plants all the time, but if we do get something that can run rampant in our environment, maybe there's no natural control for it. And these are some of the ones that we're seeing. Let me go through some of these. This is one that we haven't seen yet here in Tennessee. We don't want it. Instead, it's native to China, Japan, and Korea. It was first discovered on maple trees in Brooklyn, New York, 1996. And what it does, it just makes terrible, terrible holes and and um, gets into the trees. It's a bores holes in the trees. So it can get on. I don't know if I have another slide for this one. Well, let me talk about this one. This can get on numbers of trees. I think 200 different trees it can get on. So we'd really not like to see it. When they did find it in Chicago and New York, what they do is they cut down every tree of these trees in the area, like a quarter-mile swath. They'll just go in and cut every tree and try to get it under control. It's definitely a quarantine. The term quarantine is used often in plant and disease, insect and disease control, or they quarantine an area. This one we have seen in Tennessee. It says never found, but I always forget to change that slide. We found this about 5 years ago here in actually Chattanooga. It was in Tennessee. Let's see, first, let's see, where do we see it first? Anyway, we do have it in Chattanooga now, and it's going through our ash trees. It stays in ash trees pretty much. Doesn't get into that many, well, just ash trees, but it'll kill a tree in about 2 years, 3 years if you don't do anything. You can do some drenching of trees and make some impact if you can get on them right away. But lots of times you don't see it right away. And so the tree goes downhill. And here's what the emerald ash borer does. That takes about 2 years, 3 years, and the trees are gone. This one we've had probably 20 years now, 15 or 20 years. We found this here in Chattanooga. I think it was one of the first ones we saw on Lookout Mountain. We saw it, and now it's widespread on Signal Mountain and Lookout Mountain. It seems to like those higher elevations. Maybe that's where most of the hemlock branches are, trees are. So, but this one is very easily controlled. It can be devastating to your hemlocks, but it can be very easily controlled with a couple chemicals that I won't go into today, but one of them is that systemic chemical that we use that can get into the tree and kill these are little females with about 20 babies in each one of these little tufts. Kind of looks like styrofoam or Q-tip tips on the tree, especially in the spring. We've had this since the 1920s, but it kind of blew up in the last, 10, 15, 20 years. Goes on eastern hemlock and Carolina hemlock. But again, very, very, very controlling. We can control this problem if we take action. A lot of people aren't taking action. The people that do are finding really good control with their sprays. And some of those sprays and drenches and coating the bark can last up to 5 to 7 years. Very good. So here's what it looks like. Here's the female. Inside all that waxy material is the female, and maybe that's a crawler. There's little orange crawlers too that go off and spread throughout the tree. But the nice thing about it is it doesn't kill the tree in like 1 year. You can control it after if you see it, and it'd be nice to control it in the spring or in the fall when it's cooler, but you can kind of miss it and still save the tree. So that is the end of the disease section. So I'm going to wait. This is another short little talk that I'll give coming up. So keep looking for this one. This is called plant diagnostics. And what I'll do here is go through a lot of the things we learned in the insect seminar and this one and the disease seminar, and kind of combine them and look at some of the problem plants and see if you can figure out some of the, as a master gardener or just a backyard gardener, it's nice to see a problem and try to figure out how would you figure out that problem. So thank you for watching, and we'll call this completed. Thank you very much.